Hi, everybody. We're just waiting for a few more people to come in. All right, so hello, everyone who's joining us this evening, and thanks for being here for our webinar, LGPS Divest, the complicity of the LGPS in Israel's violations of international law. My name is Rivka Barnard, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and I'm going to be chairing the session tonight, where we'll be hearing from a very distinguished panel of experts about the complicity of business in human rights abuse against Palestinians and how pension scheme members and others can take part in the growing LGPS Divest campaign, which aims to end investment in companies complicit in human rights abuse. This webinar is being live streamed on Facebook as we speak, and that means also that there will be a video of it available afterwards if there's anyone who you knew wanted to be here but isn't with us tonight. We have 4 speakers on the panel tonight, and I'll be introducing them as they speak. But first, I wanted to just set the stage a bit for the discussion we'll be having. So for many years, people of conscience have been calling for their institutions, including pension funds, to practice ethical investment and calling for divestment or disinvestment from companies involved in human rights abuse and other kinds of harm. In April 2020, a pathway of action opened up for people to take more concrete steps in the UK. And that was when the Palestine Solidarity Campaign won a landmark Supreme Court case, which forced the UK government to overturn guidance that had previously restricted the ability of local government pension scheme funds from making ethical investment decisions. So in the wake of that court victory, LGPS Divest campaign research found that the LGPS collectively invests some 4.4 billion pounds in companies complicit in Israel's grave violations of Palestinian human rights. So it holds investments in companies with activity in Israel's illegal settlement enterprise. It holds investments in companies involved in providing infrastructure for Israel's military occupation. So that includes companies that produce surveillance software or materials or equipment used in the construction of Israel's apartheid wall. The LGPS holds shares in companies that supply weapons and military technology, which is used by Israeli armed forces in unlawful violence against Palestinians. So that research really spurred campaigners into action. And since then, LGPS scheme members and their representative trade unions, so that includes UNISON, who we'll be hearing from tonight, but also Unite and GMB, have been urging their funds to adopt policies to end investment in companies complicit in Israel's violations of international law. The LGPS Divest campaigners specifically are asking funds to end current and future investment in companies that are cited by the UN Human Rights Council's list of over 100 companies that it's found to be involved in Israel's illegal settlement enterprise. So our webinar tonight is going to look, first of all, at issues of corporate complicity, so how companies sustain human rights abuses and aid in the continuation of an unlawful situation. And then we'll look at the responsibilities of investors, including the LGPS, which is one of the largest defined benefit pension schemes in the world, and how investors need to act to end involvement with these companies. So a great opportunity for investors too, and I'm excited that everybody on the call today can help make that happen. Some really great work has already been done on this campaign, and there's plenty more to do and lots of ways to get involved. So hopefully you'll leave this webinar inspired by the great research that's been done and the action that's taken place already, and motivated to get involved. So I'll introduce our speakers now, but before I do, I just want to note that we will have some time at the end after all of our speakers have made their presentations for a question and answer. So as you're listening, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. And just to note that the chat isn't visible to everyone, but it will go directly to the Zoom host, and they'll be compiling the questions as we go, just to make sure that our speakers get to answer the broadest range. So that's a little bit of background. And now I'd like to introduce our really fantastic speakers. So our first speaker tonight will be Raya El-Sana. Raya is a Palestine-based political organizer and research coordinator for Who Profits, which is an independent research center dedicated to exposing the role of the private sector in the Israeli occupation economy. So without further ado, I will pass it over to you, Raya.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Rivka. Thank you for organizing this and having me as part of this conversation. And thank you, everyone, for joining in. Hopefully, it'll be interesting, constructive, and as Rivka said, give us, everybody, the tools to kind of go out and do more after this work. As Rivka said, I work for Who Profits, a research center that looks at corporate complicity with Israel's violation of Palestinian and also Syrian rights, particularly Syrians in the Golan, in the occupied Golan Heights, right? Violations of right that is stemming from ongoing occupation and violations of rights, but we also look at kind of how these companies are involved directly at the moment in bolstering, facilitating, and making possible these violations, but also how these violations fit within a broader structure. So companies don't operate in an abstract, they don't operate just kind of on their whim. Of course, their fundamental imperative of private companies, be it Israelis or international, public or private, is to generate greater profit, but they don't operate in an abstract. They operate within a particular system. And in this context, they operate within the system of prolonged Israeli military brutal occupation. And they are, in fact, not just money generating endeavors and institutions, but that they also facilitate and fit within a political structure. So how these companies operate, they don't operate just for the end of money making, kind of a money making endeavor, but they also fit and operate within the Israeli political structure that is designed by design and by intent, is always comes at the disadvantage of the Palestinian people, regardless of what area of involvement, of what areas they are involved in. And of course, this relationship is both how companies facilitate political projects, so how private companies are deeply complicit and deeply involved in Israel's occupation and violation of Palestinian and Syrian rights. But of course, companies also financially benefit from that process. And we've documented the involvement and the complicity of over 400 companies from all around the world, and of course also Israeli companies. And what we see is that every single violation that is inflicted against the Palestinian people or the Syrians in the Golan is facilitated and made possible through the involvement of private companies. So private companies are integral to the daily lived reality of dispossession and oppression that the Palestinian people and the Syrian people experience. And I want to highlight here maybe some of the companies that are of most interest for this particular campaign that you are that we're discussing here, that you're working on. First, the Israeli banks, and what is the role of the Israeli financial institutions? We're always told that finance is kind of a neutral realm of kind of invisible hands of money, but actually Israeli financial institutions, particularly Israeli banks, are the foundation of Israel's settlement, illegal settlement enterprise. They don't all just make it. The settlement enterprise is not just a question of kind of homes and housings for around 1 million settlers that live today across the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, and more in the Syrian Julan. But actually, a lot of that construction would not be possible without money being funneled directly from these banks. So this includes the banks like Bank Abu Ali and Bank Leumi, Bank Mizrahi and Mizrahi Tfachot. Companies, international companies like Alstom, for example, a French company, are involved in the construction of a very intricate transport infrastructure that both makes the settlement itself as an enterprise more possible, more accessible, and makes makes its expansion an easier process and a more smoother process. But it also eats away at Palestinian land, it fragments Palestinian communities. And one of the projects that Alstom is involved in is the A1 train. A1 train connects Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, partly constructed on Palestinian land, but is only accessible to Israeli citizens. Again, all of these examples will kind of resonate with kind of frameworks of apartheid, of oppression, of segregation, of racialization, and of exploitation and dispossession, and how these all work hand in hand at the same time. Alstom is also involved in the light railway in Jerusalem that is fundamentally part and makes possible what the Israeli plan of what they call the Greater Jerusalem. So not enough is Israel occupying and annexing East Jerusalem, but it actually wants to create this whole scheme of Greater Jerusalem, which is connects what is kind of a settlement ring around Jerusalem to the city of Jerusalem. So effectively expanding the municipal bounds of Jerusalem and making it possible and easy for people to move between those areas. And movement isn't just a question of kind of moving from one place to another. It's also about how you relate to space and how do you engage with that space and what that movement facilitates, what broader processes does that infrastructure and that movement facilitates. For example, what is happening in Sheikh Jarrah now is not is central to this part of the Greater Jerusalem plan, from which the light railway is also an integral project. So we have to understand these processes as interconnected. Another one is Altis, that is a Dutch company that through its Israeli subsidiaries delivers internet and communication services to settlers, both in the Syrian Julan and in the West Bank. Another is it's not just a question of delivering services, but it's also how settlements themselves become economic hubs. So settlements have factories, they have malls, they have swimming pools, they have fun parks, and so on, but also they have a lot of industry that is operating out of the settlements. And this industry both makes the settlement project viable, it makes it financially profitable, and it makes settlers want to go and live in those settlements. It provides employment opportunities, it makes it actually quite not only easy and fun to live in a settlement, but also it makes it an economical imperative for individuals to be in those settlements, to be and populate those settlements. And companies like Expedia or Airbnb or Booking.com make the settlement seem like a very neutral place, like a place like any other place. But not only that, in doing that, settlers themselves are generating money and are generating capital by being occupiers, by violating international law. You're also, as an individual settler, you're making money, so you're tying an economic interest of an individual and of a community with the oppression and dispossession of another community at the same time. And I think it's important to understand and to see, and Rivka mentioned a little bit the kind of the surveillance security industry that is really sits at the heart of Israel's occupation, at the occupation industry, particularly surveillance and security industry that is one of the most profitable and most kind of globalized industry as well. And I think this particular industry also exemplifies how the involvement of companies in Israel's occupation of Palestine, violation of Palestinian rights, is not just, it facilitates Israel's political project, it generates income and profit for those companies in that particular moment, but it also generates profits in the future sense. What do I mean by that? It generates profit in the sense of that Palestinian bodies, the repression and dispossession of Palestinians becomes also a space of a marketing tool, where you can say that actually my involvement in a violation of an international law as a corporate imperative is useful because it gives me and it generates greater money for me as a company. And this is particularly true for security companies, but it's also true for Israeli companies like, for example, Mekorot, that is now, that has developed technology of kind of water purification and a period of kind of water scarcity and international warming. This company and others are going around the world saying we can be of benefit to the world. We can deliver services that are useful for the international community and for the world at that particular at this moment in time. And I think it's important to remember and understand that none of these things are possible without the repression of the Palestinian people and without the context in which these companies operate. So I think it's also kind of how companies are involved at the moment in the violation of Palestinian rights, but we have to also be able to link what these companies do on the ground to kind of where they are positioning themselves on the international scale as well. And I think it's often we think about the company's involvement and these projects as a singular impact or a singular involvement. But really what we need to be thinking about, and we need to have to see this as how these involvement have an accumulative effect, how these involvement are actually part of a bigger structure, how these involvement of these companies are integral to Israel's imperative and agenda in Palestine and vis-a-vis the Palestinian people, which is to maintain dispossession, to entrench impoverishment. It is an attack, a direct attack on Palestinian life and on Palestinian livelihood, not just at the current moment in which we live in this moment in time, but it's an attack on the possibilities of the future. And so even if an involvement feels and looks like a singular involvement, what does it, okay, it's involved in one project, it is involved in one construction, it's involved in one train line. But these involvement, we cannot see them as singular and we cannot see them as abstract and disconnected from other forms of involvement that at the end of the day work together, both private companies in capital, money, and political power work together for an end goal that is unified and shared. They have a shared imperative of generating greater profit and dispossessing the Palestinian people and not making the life for Palestinian people viable either at this moment in time or in the future possible. And so I think we have to also be able to connect those dots together and understand corporate complicity in that sense. It's an attack on Palestinian life at this moment, but it's also on the attack on the viability of Palestinian life in the future. So no matter how minute the involvement is, no matter how insignificant it might seem for a spectator from afar, in reality, all of these involvement, no matter what they are they are positioned within this broader framework, and we have a responsibility to think about them in that way. And we have the responsibility to confront corporations and complicit corporations with that perspective and with that narrative in mind, centering what the impact of these involvement to Palestinian life at the moment, but the viability of life and livelihood in the future as well.
Thank you so much, Raya. That was really, really helpful and a really great way to start the webinar. And thanks also to the work that you do at Who Profits. That's just been so invaluable, the research, which is so detailed and precise. That's been so important to campaigners everywhere. I'm really happy to introduce our next speaker, Professor Michael Link, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967. And Professor Link's research and statements have included focus on issues of business complicity in the illegal settlements. So it's a great pleasure to have you with us, Professor Link, and the floor is yours.
Rivka, thank you very much for that. And thank you to PSC for organizing this webinar and for inviting me to speak on the issue of pension fund responsibility with respect to investments in corporations which are engaged in the Israeli settlement economy. In my presentation today, I want to address 6 issues which relate to the ethics of involvement in the Israeli settlement economy as part of the larger movement on the emerging international interest in corporate responsibility in conflict zones and in areas of serious human rights abuse. My first point goes to the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which were adopted unanimously by the UN Human Rights Council in 2011. They're a set of non-binding norms intended to influence corporate decision-making and integrating human rights principles into daily business operations. While I don't have the time today to discuss the rich range of standards embodied in the guiding principles, the core of the document focuses on the corporate responsibility to respect human rights, including by acting with due diligence to avoid violating the rights of others. There are 3 principles in particular that I want to point out that will shape my subsequent discussion on this Israeli settlement economy in the occupied Palestinian territory. Principle 11 from these guiding principles says that businesses should avoid infringing the human rights of others and should address human rights impacts where they are involved. Another principle, number 13, says that the responsibility to respect human rights requires businesses to avoid causing or contributing to adverse human rights impacts and to prevent or mitigate human rights impacts that are directly linked to their business relationships. And principle 23 says that in all contexts, businesses should comply with the applicable internationally recognized human rights and treat the risk of causing or contributing to gross human rights abuses as a legal compliance issue. The bottom line of this emerging trend on corporate responsibility for human rights is that all of the major instruments of international law, international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and international criminal law must guide corporate decisions, including pension fund decisions, in investments that involve conflict zones and areas of serious human rights violations. My second point addresses the Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory. Presently, there are close to 300 Israeli civilian settlements in occupied East Jerusalem and the West Bank, where almost 700,000 Israeli settlers live. The illegality of these settlements is one of the most settled issues in international law. The UN Human Rights Council, the UN Security Council stated in December 2016 that the settlements, and I'm quoting, are a flagrant violation under international law. This position has been affirmed by a number of other authoritative international bodies, including the UN General Assembly, the UN Human Rights Council, and the International Court of Justice. Under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which became part of international law in 2002, the Israeli settlements are a presumptive war crime. I note that the Rome Statute has been enacted in full into British law through the International Criminal Court Act 2001, passed by the British Parliament, meaning that the Israeli settlements would also be a presumptive war crime under your domestic law. My third point is that in addition to being illegal under international law, the Israeli settlements are a significant source of serious human rights violations against the protected Palestinian population living in the occupied territory. These violations include land confiscation and alienation, settler violence, discriminatory planning laws, the appropriation of natural resources such as water and land, home demolitions, forcible population transfers, labor exploitation, forced eviction and displacement, discriminatory law enforcement, and the imposition of a two-tier system of unequal political, social, and economic rights based on ethnicity that some major human rights groups have said amounts to apartheid. Above all, the settlements are an integral part of the Israeli policy to illegally annex occupied territory and to deny the right of self-determination to the Palestinians under occupation. Keep in mind that annexation is recognized in international law as a crime of aggression, and the right to self-determination is the very first human right recognized in the core human rights covenants adopted by the international community back in 1966. My fourth point is that over the past 5 years, a number of leading human rights thinkers and organizations have conducted comprehensive reviews of the human rights impact of the Israeli settlements and the role that corporations and businesses play in furthering the adverse human rights consequences of these settlements. The conclusion from all of these reports and statements is that it is impossible to either engage either directly with the Israeli settlement economy or indirectly through investments with the corporations that are engaged in the settlement economy without violating well-recognized international human rights standards and the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. To quote the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in 2018, with respect to corporate involvement in the Israeli settlement economy, he said, and I quote, "Considering the weight of the international legal consensus concerning the illegal nature of the settlements themselves and the systematic and pervasive nature of the negative human rights impact caused by them, it is difficult to imagine a scenario in which a company could engage in listed activities in a way that is consistent with the guiding principles and international law." I point out to you that similar conclusions have been reached in recent reports by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. And this follows calls by the UN Security Council in 1980 and repeated in 2016 for member states and companies not to have anything to do with the Israeli settlements, given their profound illegality and their ties to serious human rights abuses. My fifth point is that pension funds now have a very useful guidance on what companies should be doing to avoid investments should they act upon their responsibility to avoid engagement in the Israeli settlement economy. The UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights released a database of companies engaged in the Israeli settlement economy in February 2020, a database that was several years in the making in order to ensure that it was accurate. The database has identified 112 business enterprises, Israeli and international, involved in one or more activities in the Israeli settlements that were found by an earlier UN fact-finding mission in 2013 to raise grave human rights concerns. Several important Norwegian pension funds have since taken important steps to ensure that investments under their jurisdiction have no corporate link to the Israeli settlement economy. I expect that Andrew Preston will address this development in his presentation. My sixth and last point is a call for action. It's my view as Special Rapporteur that pension funds in the UK and elsewhere should be taking 3 important steps to ensure that they're in compliance with the prevailing standards on responsible corporate investments for pension funds. First, they should be conducting enhanced human rights due diligence for all companies that are listed on this database that was released in 2020, as well as others beyond the scope of the database that may well be involved in the illegal Israeli settlement economy. This should include using leverage to influence investee companies to desist from involvement in the settlement economy, as well as counting for steps taken by pension funds in this regard. Second of all, I suggest that pension funds should be divesting of their holdings in any of the companies that are listed in the UN database if that company cannot give clear assurance that it itself has removed itself entirely from the settlement economy. And third, there should be assurance that holdings in companies in high-risk conflict areas, wherever they may be in the world, are a priority for any pension fund, and that these provisions should be made in compliance with investment strategies and with ethical standards that pension funds have adopted. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Lenk. And it was really useful. I think a lot of clarity that came from that sort of legal framework that you put forward, and also reminding us that the UK is also a part of this. The UK is also bound by international law. So sometimes I think we talk about international law as though it exists outside of us, but that's a part of UK law as well, which is such an important point. And you mentioned the Norwegian case also, and that takes me to our next speaker, Andrew Preston, who is an advisor at Norwegian People's Aid and working on Norwegian Ties to the Occupation, which is a collaborative project with the Norwegian Union of Municipal and General Employees. And Andrew has decades of experience in the NGO sector, working with international development and advocacy on a broad range of sustainable development and human rights issues. So he's well placed to contribute to the discussion now. Andrew.
Thank you, Rivka, and thank you for the invitation to take part. I apologize for the horrible background, just very bad lighting in my children's bedroom. But what I'm going to do now, if you bear with me, is to try and share my screen. I've got a small presentation to show you, which I hope I can get up. Please confirm when you can see something.
Yep, we can see it.
Is that in proper presentation mode?
We can see the slides on the side, Andrew.
Let me see. Now I've bumped up. I'm not sure how to get rid of those, but
go to slideshow and then go to start at the beginning. Bingo.
Can you see everything now, Michael?
Yeah.
I'm just wondering which. I think I'll just try and manage with the slides on the right-hand side as well. That's okay. I can't work out how to get rid of those. But anyway, not to waste time. I've been asked to talk about basically what's been happening in Norway during the last few years and what we've been doing in Norwegian People's Aid and in the union, Fagforbundet. And also to share some lessons with you from our work, which might be of use to you, to those of you who are working with these issues in the UK. And what I want to do is just jump straight to a company called KLP, which is basically as close as you get to the local government pension scheme in the UK as you can. And we've basically had a good couple of years, both with KLP and a number of other Norwegian financial institutions in terms of divestment from companies involved in the settlement enterprise. And so far this year, KLP has divested from 19 different companies with links to the settlements. It's actually Norway's largest pensions company. It's a mutual insurance company that manages the pensions of almost 500,000 municipal employees in Norway. And it has assets totaling 871 billion Norwegian kroner, which is this roughly 72 billion British pounds. And its clients, who are also its owners, are basically almost all of Norway's 356 municipalities, as well as about 30 healthcare trusts, similar to the NHS trusts, and about 2,000 public sector companies. And a few of the larger cities, such as Oslo, Bergen, and Trondheim, they have their own pension schemes, and a little bit separate from what we're talking about with KLP. KLP has actually a long history of ethical divestment, going all the way back to 2001. But until this year, they had relatively few divestments from companies involved in the settlement enterprise. And actually, as recently as 2017, was making new investments in, for example, the Israeli banks, which Ria was talking about. And the latest divestments, these 19 divestments, are unquestionably a major step forward. Basically, what KLP did was to ask the following question. They basically said, can the settlements be maintained without the services or the goods which the company supplies? And I underline without. And if the answer to the question was no, then basically divestment followed. And this means that KLP basically draws the line at what it considers essential infrastructure and does not take a position on infrastructure which it considers as non-essential. And that means, for example, supermarket chains operating the settlements, bakeries, and that type of thing. And it also doesn't take a position at the current time on what we call dual-use companies, which are companies providing equipment such as bulldozers, which can be used for legitimate civilian purposes, but as we all know, also is used in the demolition of Palestinian homes on a regular basis. So there's still, it's been a good story from KLP this year, but there's still a lot to work on. And what has our role been in all this? Well, basically we've been talking to KLP since about 2013, and this has been out of the public eye, and we've basically been talking with them pretty much ever since. We've had innumerable meetings with them. We've had emails, telephone conversations, and with a pretty detailed focus on individual companies in the KLP portfolio. I think probably that's the single most important activity we've engaged in terms of dealing with KLP. The constructive engagement, the dialogue with them, which is not in the public eye, and through which we basically build trust and eventually understanding about the issues which we're trying to deal with. In addition to that, we've also published a number of reports which basically look at Norwegian links to the occupation, but have also included a focus on KLP's investments. And as recently as this year, we joined a coalition of 24 other organizations in Europe and Palestine to publish a major report called Don't Buy into Occupation, looking at links between European financial institutions and companies in the settlement enterprise. And also last year, we launched an internet-based campaign looking at banks in Norway, which provide savings opportunities in funds, which often include companies involved in the settlement enterprise. That's KLP, but as you can see from the next slide, I hope you can actually read the small writing. But this is just to give you again a flavor of what's been going on the last 3 years at least. We've had exclusions from a variety of different financial institutions. 2019, the lollipop in the middle, that's Alfred Berg, which is a specialist asset manager. They excluded 2 companies 2 years ago. DNB in 2020, that's the major Norwegian commercial bank, 2 exclusions last year. Storebrand is a major insurance and pensions company. They had 4 exclusions. And 2021, as we talked about, 19 exclusions from KLP, and also 5 exclusions from the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which Michael mentioned. And that's very significant because the Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, is one which basically sets an example for many other financial institutions who often follow what the fund does almost without questioning. So if the Sovereign Wealth Fund does something good in our eyes, then it can be very, very effective indeed. So what have we learned from basically our engagement with Norwegian financial institutions? Basically, I mean, there's many things we can say, but I've tried to make it simple and cut it down to five lessons learnt. And the first one is basically the importance of doing the homework. It's one thing to have an overall ambition of stopping these companies from supporting the settlement enterprise, but it's very important to identify what it is exactly that you want to change in your own context. So is it, for example, if we look at the UK, are we talking about a policy change? Is the Public Service Pensions, the Public Service Pension Schemes Act from 2013, is that the problem? Does that need to be changed? And do we need help from Parliament to get it changed? Or are we talking about a change of practice? Is the problem the way the LGPS asset managers do their work? Is that the problem? Is that what needs to be changed? Or is it more a fact that we need to change awareness, the attitudes, and even behavior of asset managers, pension scheme trustees, which I gather many of you are involved in that position yourselves, or even the clients of these pension schemes? What is the change that's needed? Identifying that is really quite critical to effective advocacy work. And also understand the environment in which you're working. Do the power mapping and try and work out who can actually make a difference, who can influence who, and who can help, who can be your allies in the advocacy. Number two, talk the right language. This is another crucial point when talking to financial institutions. If you go to a financial institution and start talking about Palestinian self-determination or righting the wrongs of the past, then basically you're talking to the wrong audience. And if you talk about boycotts, you may get a glazed look from the people on the other side of the table. So you need to talk in a language which the financial institutions can relate to. And this is exactly what Michael was talking about, the business and human rights agenda, the international guidelines from the UN, from the OECD, questions of legal liability. These are all things which the people working in banks and financial institutions are familiar with. And if you can get into discussion with them on those points, then you will have a receptive audience. Talk about upholding international law, respect for international law, and the heightened due diligence in conflict areas. Again, this is all written down in international humanitarian law and in the various guidance which has been issued in the last few years from the OECD and the UN, and which at least maybe not the asset managers themselves, but certainly the people working with corporate social responsibility in these institutions should be aware of. Number three, point to good practice. This is basically, you could call it shaming without the naming. You're basically pointing to good examples like what, for example, KLP has done in the last year, and basically showing the institutions that there are other institutions out there doing their best to try and get in line with international law and human rights. And by doing this, it's not just a matter of making them feel guilty, but it's also giving them the tools to have the discussions and maybe arguments within their own institutions, which are necessary before something happens. 4, be ready to adjust the advocacy. So if you're not making headway, and we often feel up here in Norway, we often feel we're not making progress, then you need to be able to take a step back and think of the other ways we can exert pressure. And then it's a question of using public campaigns, media attention, and otherwise. And I think it's absolutely possible to do the good cop, bad cop routine, where you basically have a continued dialogue in private with the financial institution, while at the same time you have a more public campaign with emails and petitions and that type of thing on the outside. I think that can be quite effective. And finally, don't expect a quick fix. I think the example from KLP, as I said, we began talking to them in 2013. and we're still talking to them. We had a meeting with them just a few weeks ago. And as I said earlier, we still have certain issues, even though they are way in front of many other, most other institutions in Norway, we still have certain issues to deal with, such as the dual use companies. So we're not finished even after 8 years of dialogue. 2 more slides. This is just an example really of doing your homework. And actually, Michael, you feature in this little chart. I'm not going to go into all of the different bubbles, but basically the gray bubble is Norway and the white area on the outside is the rest of the world. And this is really just to depict pressure points, which we basically used when we were trying to influence, and as we're still trying to influence the fund right in the middle. And by the fund, we mean the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. So all these bubbles represent different groups of actors, which in one way or another can have an influence on the fund and get the fund to ultimately make a change in its practice. So down at the bottom right is UN special procedures. That's Michael and his colleagues. Maybe you should have had a bigger circle, Michael. But anyway, this is just to give you an idea of the type of mapping which is useful when trying to think about how to go about influencing a particular institution. So this is my last slide, and I just wanted to conclude by trying to think a little bit about why are we seeing more divestment in Norway in the last few years from companies involved in the illegal settlement enterprise. And I think the first thing is that we're just generally seeing an increased awareness of business and human rights requirements in conflict areas. And this is, of course, partly because we're telling them about it all the time, but it's also because of the UN database, which Michael mentioned, and also the different work being done in different international fora to try and raise awareness about the issues and the special requirements in conflict areas. Another thing is what we perceive to be less anxiety, if we can call it that, amongst financial institutions about the legal and financial consequences of divestment. When KLP divested from the 19 companies earlier this year, they were within days blacklisted by at least a couple of states in the United States, who basically said that they would no longer have anything to do with a company like KLP, which was involved in delegitimizing and boycotting Israel. And that is to be expected. But I think because maybe more and more financial institutions are getting on board, maybe because of the increased awareness of the requirements under international law, there is less anxiety amongst these institutions about taking that step. I think they're also responding more to customer mobilization, and by that I mean the public campaigns which have been launched all around, all over the place, all over Europe, and not least here in Norway. And we've seen that the banks are responsive, and they do feel pressure to act on the emails and other petitions they're getting from customers. And finally, there is that often a little bit opaque competition between different financial institutions on being the best at ESG, and by that we mean environmental, social, and governance issues. I think historically there's been a lot of focus in financial institutions on the E and the G, on the environmental aspects of investments, not least with climate change, and on the G, which is all to do with money laundering, corruption, and the internal governance of institutions. Those are things which they've felt more comfortable dealing with. But increasingly, we're seeing much more focus on the S, on the social issues, and that's basically what we're talking about today. So I think all these 4 factors, and there are probably others too, have all contributed to a more positive situation, at least in Norway. And we hope that in the foreseeable future, together with our colleagues in that Europe-wide coalition, Don't Buy Into Occupation, that we'll begin to see many more divestments in European countries too. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andrew. That was really helpful, really inspiring to see the work that's been done over the years in Norway. And I really appreciate those tips for everyone who's here today. It's really incredibly helpful. I want to introduce our last but not least speaker, who will be able to speak very directly to the situation here in the UK, and that's Liz Wheatley, who's the chair of UNISON's International Committee. UNISON is one of the UK's largest trade unions, and it represents thousands of scheme members in the LGPS, so very relevant to the current discussion. And I believe Liz has also been involved in some of this work in her own local council. So it's a real honor to have you with us today, Liz, and the floor is yours.
And I was just about to start speaking without unmuting as well. Thank you very much, Rivka, for the introduction. And I mean, just picking up on one of the things Andrew said, if you're not going to necessarily get a quick fix. I think if you work in local government, we stopped expecting a quick fix some time ago over a whole range of things. But there's also a whole number of things that if you start campaigning around, you can make a difference quite quickly on as well. Because the campaign calling on the local government pension scheme to divest from companies involved in the illegal settlements and violation of Palestinian rights is quite a long-standing demand of UNISON. It's a campaign we first launched in 2015. In response to policy that was passed at our national conference. But of course, soon after that, I'm sure a lot of you will recall, the government announced they would introduce regulations to stop this, which obviously hampered our work then. But thankfully, the PSC brought a court case, which although lengthy, we were able to relaunch our campaign with a new guide for branches. Palestine, is your pension invested in the occupation? Which I'll mention in a couple of minutes as well. And I mean, the campaign really aims to use the financial muscle of our pension fund investments to put pressure on the companies involved in and profiting from the occupation of Palestine, particularly those companies involved in the illegal settlements, companies, as Raya said, that provide materials and equipment for buildings, for the wall, for the infrastructure needed by settlements, and of course, the equipment that's used to demolish Palestinian homes as well. And UNISON's targeting the LGPS as one of the largest pension schemes in the UK that uses investments. And indeed, I think Rivka might have mentioned right at the beginning, there's something like £4.5 billion invested in complicit companies. And in Camden, where I pay in, there's something like £28 million invested in those companies. So I think at the heart of this campaign is the principle that the LGPS is actually our deferred wages, it's our money. As council employees and pension fund contributors. So actually we should have a say where it's invested, and it should be invested in our interests. And that includes our interest in human rights and in workers' rights. I think in recent years, there's been much more awareness and an increased desire amongst our members to be able to live a more ethical life. And that does include our pensions. Of course, we want a decent life after work, but we don't want it at the expense of other people either. And I mean, PSC's research, I know, found that something like 85% of LGPS funds they analysed had investments or have investments in companies on the UN's Human Rights Council's database, the one that's been mentioned about business enterprises involved in the settlements. And I do think it's quite shocking to think that our pensions are invested in companies which are clearly contributing to violation of international law, and more specifically to the oppression of the Palestinian people. So we're calling on pension funds to begin the process of divestment from these companies as an important first step. But of course, they've already been through quite a rigorous process of expert engagement led by the UN. So, I mean, to be honest, they're unlikely to heed the calls of a pension fund to end their activity in the settlements. And therefore, UNISON are taking the view that the time for talking is over and that divestment is the only option. There's also a large number of companies which the LGPS invests in, which aren't on the UN list, but are involved in the settlements and the violation of Palestinian rights. And they're the complicit companies that I mentioned earlier. And we're calling on pension funds to begin the process of time-limited engagement with these companies, literally giving them a year, not giving them forever, because, as I say, we may not get a quick fix overnight, but I do think we can demand a time constraint on how long pension funds and fund managements have to act on this. So if a company hasn't withdrawn from the settlements after a year, then the funds should start divesting from those companies. I think the other thing that we're asking for as well is that there is actually much more robust protection for human rights and workers' rights, particularly in conflict situations. But actually that has to be included in the investment strategy statement of each fund for current and future investments. And there has to be a regular way of measuring, are they sticking to those statements? Because of course, words are very easy. It's the actions that matter. So I think for all of you on the call who are trade union activists, or indeed have been or are members of the LGPS, or to be honest, any other scheme that uses investments, I do think it's worth looking at the UNISON guide. I'm not saying that just because I'm in UNISON, but looking at it and start campaigning for divestment. It actually is really thorough. It can help you look at how you can run a local campaign and provide you with a lot of the resources. There are pro forma letters, petitions, all kinds of documents that you would want to use. And funnily enough, we started using it in our branch, not so much around Palestine, but we wanted to look at divestment around the climate emergency from the fossil fuel industry. And we've been working around that for a number of years, actually, and done deputations to the pension committee, to the full council meetings. I think we've done 2 to full council meetings, of which divesting the pension fund was absolutely central to them. But one of the things that's evolved out of that has been we now have a working group of UNISON members in the branch who are starting to look at the wider picture of ethical investment of our whole funds, and of course, therefore, with particular emphasis on Palestine. That was thrown up into very sharp relief following the protests early this year, the absolutely huge protests that the trade union movement did mobilise around, and a whole number of unions encouraged their members and took to the streets, marching together, with a banner for all of the unions. And as I say, that really prompted a group of our members to start saying we had to question the ethics of our pension investment beyond the fossil fuel industry and start looking at Palestine. And I mean, I know there's a couple of people from Camden PSC on the call here, and it was only recently we're emailing about what we can try and do together to try and give this a greater emphasis, so that it's both us as trade unionists looking at our pension fund investment and local campaigners coming together to do this. And I think that's a really, really useful way forward for people who want to have a campaign around divestment. And of course, as well as working, in our local branches to do this, UNISON nationally is really proud to be working with PSC on the campaign, and certainly using, I should probably say sharing their resources, but I think quite heavily leaning on them and using them. And of course, with Who Profits, and we are really pleased to be able to support their research into some of the complicit companies. But of course, again, we know that the government has once again always threatening to put a stop to this kind of campaigning around BDS and around divestment in particular, with the legislation that's designed to force public bodies to follow UK foreign policy in investment, also purchasing and procurement. And we're very, very concerned about that, because I mean, apart from the fact that we'll threaten, our work, PSC's work and what have you, in support of workers' rights and international law in Palestine, but actually our general work on business and human rights and ethical procurement across the globe. So, I mean, I'd like to also offer here, as well as support for the campaign for divestment of the LGPS from companies investing in the occupied territories, we will of course be fighting against the government's proposal to insist that we have to follow their foreign policy on investment as well. So thank you very much for inviting us to speak and having a chance to give an overview to what we want to try and do in UNISON. And of course, we've been more than happy to hear from UNISON members or people, LGPS payers who want to try and get involved by the union as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Liz. Great, so great to hear from somebody who has so much experience, and there were a lot of great tips in what you said also about how this is connected to other sort of progressive looks at investments, and as you said, at the money of the people who've been paying into these schemes. I think it was really inspiring. Great set of talks. Seems like there's so much material here that we could go into longer. I do have some questions that have been coming in, so I want to go straight to the question and answer period now. But just to mention also that I think you can see in the chat that Lewis has been attaching some links to the broader materials about this campaign for people that want to get more information and want to get involved. And I think that UNISON guide is in that link also, Liz. So thanks for mentioning that. The first question I wanted to deal with was a sort of technical question for you, Andrew, if that's all right. You mentioned in your talk, you mentioned things about exclusions that had been, that were a part of the work done in Norway, and somebody was just asking if you could say more about what is an exclusion, maybe as opposed to a divestment. And just attached to that, there was a question about what involvement pension fund members had in pressuring the KLP to divest. So that's for you, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the questions. Basically, a divestment is obviously when a financial institution decides to sell its holdings in a particular company. But an exclusion is in a sense going a little bit beyond that and saying this company we do not want to be involved in until that company changes its behavior, and they will normally be put on a so-called exclusion list, which is normally on the website of the financial institution, which anybody can have a look at. And so I think that's what it means. And in terms of pension fund members taking part, well, it's always difficult to know what has contributed to a particular divestment taking place. But what we did do in 2019. Well, we actually began working with it in 2018 and warning the financial institutions that it was coming. But in 2019, we launched a Norwegian language website where basically you can go into the website and check your own bank. And KLP has its own banking system, has its own banking service. So KLP is not just a pensions provider, it's also a bank. And you could go in there, and if you had many people have their pensions in KLP, also use it as their bank. They could go into the website, write KLP, and then the website would tell you that KLP is unfortunately invested in a number of 11 companies that we chose with particularly problematic involvement in the occupied territories. And if you wanted to, you could then press another button and send a polite message to your bank saying, this is not what I don't think this is acceptable, and I would like to know what you're going to do to change this. And we know that because of all the rules about data, we don't know who sent what messages, or we don't know which who sent the messages, but we do know that the banks received. We do know which banks received how many messages, and we know that KLP got a lot of messages from its customers, and we hope that also made a contribution to the final divestment, though, but we don't know for sure. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Really helpful. I have a question from someone who's a member of the LGPS. And so, Liz, this one might be especially for you, though others can chime in also. The question is, what can I do to lobby my fund to remove my money from companies involved in human rights abuses? So what can I do to get involved?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you're a retired member or somebody currently working in a branch from it, either way, I would say contact your local UNISON branch and find out, first of all, if they've got anything that they're doing to start off with, because you may not be the only person thinking this, you just may not be in the loop of what's happening, or indeed you might be the first person to suggest it and to get the ball rolling on it. I do think, you know, I mean, through that, so for instance, we've done, as I said, deputations to the pension fund and to the full council meeting, and it's much easier to do those if you're part of the union branch. You can do it together, get a group of people to do it. But also, if you're not working but still a union member, yes, suggest it to the branch, but find out if you've got a local PSC group as well. Because I'm sure they will be, I mean, a lot of them already are doing local campaigning and are in touch with the local UNISON branches. But even if they haven't really established that contact yet, I know a lot of them are really keen to do campaigning around it. And so I do think and they can also do deputations to pension funds. You don't have to be somebody who works in the council to do that, and indeed to the full council meeting. I also think, you know, a bit of that old school protesting outside some of those meetings with some flyers about the investment, because we also need to create a bit more knowledge and understanding about it and about what the companies do. So I think things like that. I know our local Camden PSC has done a letter to the local press about it. I think that's a really good way to try and get the ball rolling. So you might feel like you're one person asking it, but actually I think as soon as you put your head above the parapet, you will find other people. I'm sure PSC can put you in touch with the group that's most local to you, and certainly via UNISON you can find out your local branch and how to contact them if you're not already, as I say, in the loop with them. But I would say, you know, do that. So is there somebody else who you know in UNISON in the same branch who would help you get a petition together? And obviously nowadays we tend to do a lot of those online, but an online petition is a really good way to get started, because there you have the names of other people who would be interested in campaigning with you. So I think that, you know, and I think getting that first step of finding the next few people who want to do it with you is a really good way to get the ball rolling, to feel like there's actually enough of you to start putting a bit of pressure on the council, you know, a group of you to do that deputation or petition, or to stand outside in a cold winter night with some leaflets to councillors as they're approaching. So they would be my first suggestions. Thanks.
Thanks a lot for that, Liz. And again, for folks that are looking to get involved, there's some messages in the chat about how to get involved, and including what Lewis has just said, that there's some leaflets also if you do want to use that. But there's a way to get involved for scheme members, and then there's also a way for members of the public to get involved, which Liz has also spoken about. So that's really useful. I've just got my eye on the time here. I have two more questions that have come in, and I think then I'll cap it at that. But there is, of course, a way to get in touch with the PSC if people have further questions. But this one, I think, could go to anyone, but it'd be great to hear from Michael or Raya on this. My pension fund chair has told me they prefer engagement with companies and not divestment. So the question is how to convince them that companies heavily involved in the settlement enterprise or on that OHCHR list should be subjected to divestment. So that question about divestment versus engagement and how to make the argument.
I was going to suggest Raya go first, and I'm happy to then respond to that after that. No.
Yeah, go, Mike.
Okay, no. My sense is this: is that it's in terms of engagement, this can be useful in situations where human rights issues are emerging, where it's unclear which direction this particular conflict zone or this occupation, or you know the country itself is heading with respect to this. The difference I see with respect to the occupied Palestinian territory is that it's so clear that this direction is away from any Palestinian rights or Palestinian self-determination. The new government in Israel has made it very clear that they see annexation in the future. They do not support a Palestinian state, even on even in a Bantustan form, and that they intend to keep on expanding and growing the Israeli settlements. In engagement in the sense of, can we talk sense to you about paying attention to the human rights issues here, and so you'll be more compliant with them through your investments in the occupied Palestinian territory. I'm afraid that that train has left the station a long time ago. The conclusions by major human rights groups, ones that I mentioned, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, have long said that this occupation is entrenched, and it continues to be entrenched because Israel pays such a small price. Israel is worried about issues involving divestment. Israel is worried about a BDS campaign. So when corporate investors or pension funds start saying, we're going to cease any involvement with companies that are involved in the settlement economy, it has a significant impact. That's why Israel was so vehemently opposed to the creation and release of the UN database in 2020, and will continue to be opposed to any form of divestment. Look at the effort in the United States to pass anti-BDS laws, and the efforts, for example, in the state of New York, where the Attorney General's now said they're thinking of divesting their pension funds from Unilever, which is the owner of Ben & Jerry's ice cream. As you know, Ben & Jerry's ice cream has said after the end of 2022, they will no longer permit their ice cream to be sold in the Israeli settlements, so they'll continue to manufacture and sell it in Israel itself. Some of these laws in the United States are actually are an upside down version of divestment, where they're divesting in any country they think is delegitimizing Israel, when the real focus of these divestment campaigns is actually to end the occupation in the Palestinian territory. So my conclusion is, I don't think at this stage, with respect to the Palestinian territory, engagement gets you any further. That is just something that belongs to yesterday's playbook, and I think the issue on the table today has to be divestment.
Thanks for that, Michael. That seems really clear. I did want to just mention, because it's come up in what you've just said, Michael, and also I think, Liz, you brought up that there is a potential, the UK government has announced previously that it intends to try to pass some anti-BDS legislation. That hasn't happened yet. The last time the UK government tried to do that, as we've mentioned, the PSC took the government to court and won a court case, which allows this work to happen. But I do want to mention that that is on our radar at the PSC, so stay tuned for more on that. But for the time being, that court case in April 2020 that the PSC won really opened a lot of doors for this work to succeed. I'm just noticing the time, and I want to close up here, but I did want to give the other speakers on the panel, so Raya, Andrew, and Liz, another chance just to either speak on that topic of engagement versus divestment, or give any sort of closing thoughts, and then we can close up for tonight. Raya, do you want to close up with anything?
I think I totally agree with Michael that the whole question of engagement is, it's no secret that companies are deeply complicit and deeply involved in the settlement enterprise, but also not just the settlement enterprise, the broader violations that Israel is involved in vis-a-vis the Palestinian rights. And I think it's kind of, I don't know, like what would one say, kind of an entry point, like the way that companies and capital is structured. In a way, it gives people opportunities that are not directly on the ground, but it gives people around the world also the opportunity and a way and a vessel to impact changes on the ground and to impact what is happening in Palestine. And I think that's it works to our disadvantage sometimes, often, but it also can work in our advantage of kind of how do we work in solidarity and what does it mean to do solidarity. And it gives us a direct channel and a direct way to be involved in those processes, as well as kind of direct solidarity with the Palestinian people, but also engaging in a process of change on a global scale of how corporations act, how do we adhere to international law and human rights, how do we respect human dignity and human life, not just in relation to people in Palestine, but also in relation to how do we discipline corporations in the way that they engage in political processes and how do they act on a global scale. And I think that has impact both in relation to Palestine, but it has an impact also in relation to kind of how corporations act on a global scale. And I think that's important for all of us as humans of this world, regardless of where we are and regardless of the specific task of the moment. So yeah, divestment is certainly one of the ways to kind of ensure that that is also possible.
Great, thank you very much, Raya. Very inspiring words. It is. I do think it's important for us to think of this as an opportunity, and we should think of it as an opportunity for the investors also. I mean, they have an opportunity to be on the right side of history, and we're helping give them that chance, right? So Andrew, I'll go to you, and then Liz, if you wanted to close this off after Andrew.
Thank you. I don't think I need to say that much more on the question of engagement. I mean, the international guidelines for business and human rights do basically say that you should try to engage first before you divest. But as has already been said, many of the companies that we're talking about have been told about the problems for years, if not decades, and have not reacted. And those companies who possibly were not aware of the problems they are involved in often are totally unresponsive. So, for example, KLP, the 19 companies they approached last year to see if they could get any response out of. I don't think any of them actually responded substantively. I think there was one of the 19 which actually responded, and the rest just ignored repeated attempts to engage. So that's the reality. So I would support what's already been said by Michael and Ria. And just to end by basically saying thank you again for the invitation, and to wish all of you who are looking to influence your local government pension scheme the best of luck. Don't give up, be persistent, and hopefully one day you'll get there.
Thank you, Andrew. And Liz, do you want to give us final words of inspiration and motivation?
You suddenly set a high bar. Thank you, Rivka. I mean, yeah, I mean, on the engagement versus divestment, I mean, the first time we really got frustrated by this was actually around the fossil fuel investment, when we kept going to the pension funds and the kind of fund management that managers, the investment managers kept saying, oh, you know, it's really important that we talk, and they kept trying to measure everything they did by engagement and not by divestment. And we were saying, but there's years here, if you're talking and talking and talking, but the investment hasn't gone down. So clearly the talking doesn't work. And I think the same is absolutely true, as people have said over Palestine. You know, that's why we're saying for the complicit companies, give them a year, give them time to sort out their divestment, but a year is enough. They don't need longer. And of course, you know, the companies you know, on the UN list have already had that time. They've had chance to mend their ways voluntarily. So I think we have to now say, you know, we're tired of talking. The words are cheap, actually, but our investment isn't. You know, it's a lot financially, and will have an impact on you. As ever, when you do these meetings, you end up having a little bit of direct messaging to people. And of course, and you know, there's, as well as being some people from my local PSC, that there's some people who I know who are UNISON activists on the call. And somebody just reminded me that only a couple of weeks ago, our LGBT plus national conference passed a couple of motions over Palestine, including wanting to campaign much more around divesting the LGPS. And I think that's just another demonstration of how far you know, how widespread that the sentiment is that actually we do have to have ethical investment, and Palestine is very, very clearly at the heart of that. So I think the final thing really is that, of course, solidarity is a central tenet of the trade union movement. You know, we say, don't we, you know, divided we fall, united we stand. And I think that's as true internationally as it is true of your local campaign and local dispute. Actually, we in UNISON, we have a proud record of standing and fighting with our international siblings, and we want to keep doing that. And on a local level, I don't think that our members want to profit from the occupation of Palestine and from investment into Palestine and the occupied territories. And I think therefore it's absolutely right that we're committed as a union branch, as a union, national union, to do that, as a trade union to do that. And it's absolutely fantastic that we can link up with campaigners both from Palestine but internationally, where they've done a lot of this work, so we can learn from them, but hopefully where we can keep campaigning together to make it a top priority. Thanks.
Cheers, Liz. Thanks very much for that. I knew you would end us off with inspiring and motivational words. Thanks very much to everyone for being here tonight. And thank you so much to our speakers who have brought so much to the conversation. Please do remember, everyone, to check out lgpsdivest.org, where you can find much more information about all of this and the resources that have been mentioned, and look forward to campaigning alongside all of you in the future. Thank you.